Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
You're the new maid, aren't you? Sandra suppressed her surprise and nodded slightly, replying. Yes, ma'am. The woman, whom Sandra quickly recognized as Mrs. Martha, her boyfriend's mother, showed no sign of a welcoming gesture. Instead, she abruptly turned away and said, "Follow me. We have a lot of work to do." Sandra stepped into the mansion, observing the walls adorned with portraits of ancestors and the dark wood furniture, which gave the place a solemn atmosphere. The marble floor reflected the light from the chandeliers, and the grandeur of every detail made her feel even smaller. Mrs. Martha walked ahead without looking back, giving quick instructions about where to place Sandra's belongings and how to start her work. As they passed through the long corridors, Sandra thought about Victor. He always spoke about his mother with affection, but he never mentioned how strict and cold she could be. Maybe his absence had made Mrs. Martha more bitter, or perhaps this was her true nature. Either way, Sandra decided she would keep her cover for a little longer to understand more about the family she was about to join. Sandra was led to a small room downstairs, far from the luxurious quarters of the family. The room was simple, with a narrow bed, an old wooden table, and a small window overlooking the back garden. Clearly, this room was meant for the house staff, which only reinforced Sandra's belief that she was being treated like a servant. "Start by cleaning the main rooms," Mrs. Martha commanded with the authoritative tone that Sandra was beginning to get used to. "And don't forget to polish the chandeliers. I hope you know how to do it properly." Sandra nodded, keeping her expression neutral, but inside, she was preparing for the challenge. It was clear Mrs. Martha had no intention of making her life easy here. But that only strengthened Sandra's resolve. If she truly wanted to understand Victor's family, she would have to endure this trial. As she began cleaning the main room, Sandra observed every detail of the decor, the portraits on the walls, and the heavy silence that enveloped the space. She knew that to Victor, this mansion represented home, but to her, it was a testing ground where every action she took would be scrutinized. For a moment, she wondered if her decision to hide her true identity was the right one, but she quickly pushed those doubts aside. To understand the true nature of Mrs. Martha and the other family members, she needed to remain as she was, a stranger among strangers, unseen but seeing everything. The first day passed slowly, with Sandra being challenged at every turn. Mrs. Martha seemed to distrust her abilities, always finding something to criticize, whether it was the way she dusted the furniture or the speed with which she completed tasks. But Sandra, with patience and perseverance, completed every task carefully, knowing that each day was an opportunity to learn more about the people around her. When night finally fell and the mansion was engulfed in darkness, Sandra returned to her small room, exhausted. Despite her fatigue, she felt that she had taken the first step in her mission. The next challenge would be resisting the temptation to reveal her true identity and continuing to observe like a shadow, uncovering the secrets this house was hiding. Sandra woke at dawn as the first rays of sunlight barely broke through the small window in her room. She had had a restless night, burdened by the situation she had decided to face. She knew that staying at the mansion wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to discover the truth about Victor's family and, more importantly, about the life she would face if she decided to commit to him. The first challenge of the day came quickly. Mrs. Martha was waiting for her in the main dining room, a room that seemed to be the heart of the mansion with its wood-paneled walls and heavy velvet curtains. Sandra had barely washed her face and brushed her hair before being called to start her work. "Today you will clean the windows in the dining room and the living room," Mrs. Martha ordered without a second glance. "And make sure they are spotless. I won't tolerate any dust." Sandra nodded silently, picking up the cleaning supplies they had provided her. The task seemed simple, but she soon realized the mansion was vast, full of intricate details that required constant attention. The large windows, though beautiful, were difficult to reach, and the crystal chandeliers hung so high that she could only clean them with the help of a ladder. As she worked, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the walls of the mansion had eyes, and every move she made was being judged. Occasionally, Mrs. Martha would pass through the room, observing her progress with a scrutinizing gaze but saying nothing. The tension between them was palpable, and Sandra knew that any mistake could be used against her. As the morning wore on, exhaustion began to weigh on Sandra. She wasn't accustomed to such physically demanding work, and every muscle in her body ached, but she didn't allow herself to rest. She knew her success depended on her ability to endure these trials without losing her composure. Every completed task brought her closer to her goal of understanding her boyfriend's family from the inside. Her purpose remained steadfast in her mind, to learn about Victor's family without them knowing who she really was. While cleaning one of the large mirrors in the living room, Sandra noticed an older man watching her from the doorway. It was Mr. George, the mansion's butler, whom she had briefly met the day before. His expression was friendly, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was observing her very closely, too. "Good morning," Mr. George said with a smile. "I see you've started with the mistress's tasks already." Sandra turned to face him and returned his smile. She wasn't sure how much Mr. George knew about her, but her instincts told her he could be a valuable ally if she handled things correctly. "Good morning, Mr. George." "Yes, the mistress has very high standards," Sandra replied, choosing her words carefully. George nodded as if in agreement, but his eyes still watched her with curiosity. "Indeed, Mrs. Martha is not easily pleased. But don't worry, we've all gotten used to her demands over time." Sandra didn't know if George's words were meant to comfort her or serve as a warning, but she decided to take them as a reminder that she needed to stay vigilant. As George left, she wondered how much he knew about this family and whether she could trust him in the future. That day continued with an endless series of tasks. Sandra tried not to think about Victor and the life she had left behind, focusing on the task at hand. However, as the afternoon wore on, she began to wonder how long she could keep her identity hidden. The mansion, with its grandeur and coldness, began to feel like a prison, and Mrs. Martha's constant watchful gaze loomed over her like a threatening shadow. When night finally fell, Sandra returned to her small room, physically and emotionally exhausted. Yet despite her fatigue, something inside her pushed her to keep going. She knew that each day spent in the mansion was an opportunity to learn more about the true nature of those who lived there. And though the work was exhausting, she was determined to discover if Victor was different from his mother and whether her love for him could overcome the barriers that were slowly emerging between them. Before going to bed, Sandra sat by the window, looking out at the dark garden. In the distance, she could see the lights of the village of Salana twinkling through the night fog. She wondered if the villagers had any idea what was happening behind the walls of the mansion, or if, like her, they only saw what the family wanted them to see. With those thoughts in mind, Sandra closed her eyes and drifted into sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and tests she would have to face. Sandra's third day at the mansion began much like the previous ones, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the small window of her room and Mrs. Martha already waiting with demands for flawless work. However, something had changed in the atmosphere of the house. Sandra felt that she was no longer the only observer. Now, it seemed that others were also paying attention to her every move. While carrying out her duties in the main living room, Sandra once again noticed the presence of Mr. George, the butler, who seemed to be finding excuses to appear in the rooms where she was working. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence, but soon she realized that George was genuinely interested in her situation. It was unusual for household staff to interfere in others' affairs. "Are you working in the library today?" George suddenly appeared in the doorway as Sandra dusted the bookshelves. "Yes, Mr. George," she replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "It's a beautiful place. There are many interesting books here." George smiled with a look of both nostalgia and understanding, as if he knew something Sandra hadn't yet discovered. "Yes, the library is one of the oldest parts of this house. It has witnessed many generations of this family. But have you found anything that caught your attention?" Sandra looked up, trying to decipher the tone of the question. It sounded casual enough, but there was something hidden beneath those words. It was clear that George suspected something, though he wasn't sure exactly what. "I haven't had time to really look through the books," Sandra replied with a smile. "But there are certainly many interesting stories on these shelves." George nodded slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on her. "There are stories here that could fill 1,000 lifetimes, miss. Some are written in books, and some exist only in the minds of those who have lived in this house." George's words echoed in Sandra's mind as she continued her work. She began to realize that George could be a valuable source of information if she could earn his trust. She knew that sooner or later she would need allies in the mansion if she wanted to uncover the truth. As the days went by, Sandra and George began to have more frequent conversations. While he never directly asked about her identity or intentions, his words were always filled with hints, as if he were waiting for her to reveal something. For her part, Sandra remained cautious, responding with the same subtlety, aware that any misstep could ruin her plan. Meanwhile, Mrs. Martha continued with her endless demands, giving Sandra increasingly difficult tasks, as if she were testing the limits of her patience. The coldness with which Mrs. Martha treated her made Sandra wonder how someone like Victor, warm and fair, could have grown up under her influence. However, whenever she felt tempted to break her silence and reveal her true identity, she reminded herself of her goal: to understand the true nature of her boyfriend's family before committing fully to Victor. One day, while George helped her move some heavy books in the library, he dared to ask a direct question. "Tell me, Miss Sandra, have you ever thought about what you would do if things weren't as they seem?" Sandra paused for a moment, surprised by the question. She had been so careful with her responses that she hadn't expected George to confront her so directly. Even so, she decided to maintain her cover. "I think all of us have had to face unexpected situations at some point, Mr. George. But the important thing is how we respond to those situations." George looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read before replying. "Wise words, miss. I just hope you're ready for what you might uncover in this house." Sandra remained silent, reflecting on his words. It was clear that George knew more than he let on, and his warning only strengthened her resolve to continue with her mission. She began to understand that the family's secrets were deeper than she had imagined, and the real challenge wasn't just uncovering them but deciding what to do with that information once she had it. With each passing day, Sandra felt as if she were walking a tightrope, with the truth within reach but also the risk of losing everything if she made a mistake. Meanwhile, George continued to watch her with curiosity and caution, as if waiting for the moment when Sandra would finally reveal her true purpose. Sandra knew that the situation was becoming more complicated. The relationship she was building with George could be an advantage, but it could also be a trap, depending on how she handled it. And as she continued to play the role of the maid, part of her began to wonder if Victor had any idea what she was doing and how he would react when he found out the truth. Later that day, as Sandra returned to her room, she couldn't stop thinking about George's words. She knew that he was getting closer to discovering the truth, and she also knew that when that happened, she would have to make an important decision. But for now, her priority was to stick to the plan and remain calm, even as everything around her seemed to become more uncertain. The days in the mansion began to feel endless for Sandra. Every morning, she woke up before the sun rose, knowing that another day of exhausting tasks and constant supervision from Mrs. Martha awaited her. As the days passed, the burden of the lie she had created began to take a toll on her spirit. The physical labor, which she was not accustomed to, left her drained, but what truly began to wear her down was the emotional strain of keeping her true identity a secret. Every interaction with Mrs. Martha was a reminder that Sandra was playing a dangerous role, and her coldness was becoming harder to endure. Sandra knew she couldn't let her emotions betray her, but the burden of her deception weighed heavier than she had anticipated. One afternoon, while kneeling on the floor of the main living room, scrubbing the tiles until they shone, Mrs. Martha entered the room. At first, she said nothing, silently watching Sandra work as if waiting to catch a mistake, an excuse to criticize her. Finally, After a few minutes, Mrs. Martha spoke, her voice as cold as ever. "Sandra, it seems like you're taking too much time on a simple task. Can't you work faster?" Sandra bit her lip to avoid responding impulsively. She knew that any inappropriate words could jeopardize her position. Instead, she kept her head down and replied gently. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll do my best to work more efficiently." Mrs. Martha looked at her with dissatisfaction before turning and leaving the room, leaving Sandra alone with her thoughts. As she continued to work, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep up this charade. Mrs. Martha's patience seemed to be wearing thin, and Sandra feared that at any moment, she might decide to fire her, ending her mission sooner than expected. That night, as she lay on her narrow bed, Sandra felt lonelier than ever. The distance between her and Victor, once merely a geographical gap, now felt like an unbridgeable chasm. She wondered if he would ever know what she was doing and if he would understand or judge her for it. Although she was certain of her feelings for him, she couldn't shake the doubt that their love might not be strong enough to overcome the barriers his mother was erecting. As the weeks passed, Sandra began to notice small changes in her behavior. She became more cautious in her interactions with Mrs. Martha, carefully weighing every word and action. She no longer felt confident in her decisions, and the constant scrutiny she endured made her feel increasingly vulnerable. One afternoon, while helping George in the back garden, Sandra let out an unintentional sigh. George, who had noticed her fatigue, approached her with concern. "Sandra, you seem tired. Maybe you should take a break." Thank you for watching the video all the way through. You are our biggest motivation to keep creating. Let us know where you're watching from so we can see how far this video has reached around the world. Don't forget to hit like if you found it interesting, and share it with your friends too. Sandra looked up and gave him a weak smile, appreciating his concern but knowing she couldn't allow herself to rest. "I'm fine, George. I just need to finish this task." George observed her in silence for a moment before nodding. "I know working here isn't easy, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." She thanked him for his kindness, but deep down, she knew she couldn't fully trust anyone in the mansion, no matter how friendly George seemed. Keeping her secret was paramount. However, George's words reminded her of the loneliness she felt in her mission. She couldn't help but think that if Victor were here, things might be different. But he was far away, and she had to face this challenge on her own. The next day brought a new set of challenges. Mrs. Martha, seemingly displeased with Sandra's pace, began assigning her even more difficult tasks, as if she were trying to break her. Despite her exhaustion, Sandra remained determined not to give up. Every completed task was a step toward her goal, though she began to wonder if all this effort was worth it. Sandra had underestimated the power of the mansion's environment. What had initially seemed like a simple act of pretending to observe Victor's family had now become a burden that was slowly wearing her down. The oppressive silence of the house, the constant tension, and Mrs. Martha's relentless supervision began to erode her resolve. Finally, one night, Sandra allowed herself to cry. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion overwhelming her, it was the doubt that had taken root in her heart. Was she doing the right thing? Was all of this worth it for a man she loved but who had no idea what she was enduring? Tears streamed down her face as she stared out of the small window in her room, watching the shadows dance in the garden under the moonlight. Sandra realized she was closer to her breaking point than she had been willing to admit. The weight of her lies was becoming too heavy, and time was running out for her to decide her next move. With a heavy heart, Sandra realized she would have to face the truth, both with herself and with Victor, before the lies consumed her entirely. The next day began like any other at the mansion, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the small window in Sandra's room. However, there was a feeling in the air, a sense of impending tension that she couldn't ignore. Sandra had spent weeks at the mansion, enduring Mrs. Martha's demands, and now she felt that something was about to change. As she went about her daily tasks, Sandra overheard a conversation between two servants in the kitchen. They spoke in hushed tones, but what they said immediately caught her attention. "They say Mrs. Martha has started planning to separate Mr. Victor from that city woman," one of the servants said, her voice full of concern. "Yes, apparently she already has someone in mind, a girl from a prestigious family. She doesn't want Victor marrying just anyone," the other servant replied, nodding solemnly. Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mrs. Martha didn't just want to control Victor's life, she was already planning his future without any regard for his wishes or feelings. This revelation stunned Sandra but also ignited a new resolve within her. She couldn't let Mrs. Martha control Victor's life like that, and she had to learn more about these plans before it was too late. That afternoon, while cleaning the main living room, Sandra decided to get closer to George. She knew he was one of the few people in the mansion who might have valuable information and might be willing to share if he trusted her enough. "George, I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me the other day, about how things in this house aren't always what they seem," Sandra began, trying to sound casual as she rearranged the books on the shelf. George, working nearby, looked up with a calculating expression. "And what's been troubling you, Sandra?" he asked, feigning ignorance of the tension in her voice. Sandra paused for a moment before answering, carefully choosing her words. "I overheard some of the staff talking about Mrs. Martha's plans for Victor, and I'm worried about what that could mean for him." George sighed, as if he had been expecting Sandra to bring this up at some point. "It's no secret that Mrs. Martha has always controlled her son's life, more than he even realizes. But I can't say much more, Sandra. In this house, information is power, and that power can be dangerous." Sandra's suspicions were confirmed. George knew more than he was willing to share, but he was also aware of the dangers of divulging too much. However, Sandra couldn't give up. She needed to find a way to protect Victor from his mother's plans, and that meant earning George's trust at all costs. "I understand, George. I just want to help Victor, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure he's safe," Sandra said, trying to convey her sincerity. George stared at her for a few seconds, as if assessing her honesty. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. "Sandra, there are things in this house that are better left unknown. But if you truly want to help Victor, you'll have to be ready to face some truths that could change everything. I can only tell you this. There's a drawer in Mrs. Martha's study that contains letters and documents that might help you understand more about what she's planning. But be careful, because if you're caught, there will be no way back." Sandra's heart raced. She knew she was about to cross a dangerous line, but she also knew she couldn't turn back. That night, after making sure everyone was asleep, she decided to act. She patiently waited in her room until the mansion was enveloped in silence, then quietly stepped out, heading toward Mrs. Martha's study, trying to avoid making any noise. The darkness of the hallway only heightened the tension in her chest, but she was determined to continue. As she approached the study, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down her spine. She knew she was taking a big risk, but she couldn't stop now. She stepped into the room, where only the faint moonlight filtered through the curtains. Sandra moved toward the dark wooden desk and began carefully searching the drawers. Finally, she found the drawer George had mentioned. It was locked, but fortunately, there was a small key lying on the desk. With trembling hands, she picked it up, and with a soft click, the drawer opened. Inside, she found a small stack of letters and documents. Without hesitation, she began going through them, knowing she didn't have much time. What she found stunned her. The letters were from a wealthy family living in a nearby city, and the documents appeared to be agreements between Mrs. Martha and them to arrange a marriage between Victor and their daughter. Sandra felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. Mrs. Martha was willing to sacrifice her son's happiness just to maintain the family's status and reputation. The letters made it clear that everything had almost been finalized, and they were simply waiting for Victor to accept what had already been decided for him. As Sandra carefully returned the letters to the drawer, she realized the significance of what she had uncovered. She knew she would have to confront Mrs. Martha sooner or later, but now more than ever, she needed to think of a strategy not only to expose her plans but also to protect Victor from the fallout. Sandra left the study with her heart pounding. She had taken a dangerous step, but she knew it was necessary. Now, her goal was clear: she had to find a way to reveal the truth to Victor before Mrs. Martha could manipulate the situation to her advantage. The following days became a test of patience for Sandra. Every time she encountered Mrs. Martha, she felt as though the woman could sense what she had done. However, she remained steadfast, continuing with her daily tasks and waiting for the right moment to act. Finally, one afternoon, when Victor was scheduled to return to the mansion, Sandra decided that she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to speak with him before Mrs. Martha had a chance to influence his decisions. She knew Victor was planning to return that day, and Sandra was determined to face him with the truth. When Victor arrived, the atmosphere in the mansion became tense. Mrs. Martha greeted him with a smile that Sandra immediately recognized as fake, but Victor seemed unaware of it. Tired from his journey, Victor didn't suspect what was happening around him. That night, Sandra made sure to get Victor alone in the back garden, where no one could hear them. With her heart racing, she decided to tell him the truth. "Victor, there's something I need to tell you, something I discovered, and I think you need to know," Sandra began, trying to find the right words. Victor looked at her with surprise but also concern. "What is it, Sandra? Why do you look so serious?" Sandra took a deep breath before continuing, knowing that what she was about to say could change everything between them. "I found out that your mother is arranging a marriage for you with another woman, someone from a prestigious family, and it seems like everything has already been decided." Victor's face paled as he listened to Sandra's words, disbelief and confusion clear on his face. "That can't be true. My mother would never do something like that without talking to me first." "I'm sorry, Victor, but it's true. I found letters and documents confirming it. Your mother is willing to do anything to preserve the family's social status, even if it means sacrificing your happiness." Victor was silent, struggling to process this information. Sandra could see him grappling with the situation, and the pain was evident on his face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Victor looked up and took Sandra's hand. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Sandra. I need to talk to my mother. This can't go on." Sandra nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. She knew that the confrontation between Victor and Mrs. Martha was inevitable and that the consequences could be devastating. But she also knew that she had done the right thing by revealing the truth. Victor returned to the mansion, determined to confront his mother. Sandra followed behind, knowing that the battle had only just begun. The atmosphere in the mansion became more tense than ever since Victor's return. Sandra could sense the anticipation of the confrontation between him and Mrs. Martha, and she knew that whatever happened in the next few hours could change their lives forever. Victor entered the mansion with determined steps, Sandra close behind him, trying to keep calm. The cold, oppressive atmosphere of the mansion seemed to be bracing itself for the storm that was about to unfold. Victor marched straight to his mother's study, where he knew he would find her reviewing some documents, as she often did in the afternoon. Without knocking, Victor pushed the door open forcefully. Mrs. Martha looked up, surprised by her son's sudden appearance. However, her surprise quickly turned into a calm expression, one that Sandra recognized as a sign that a confrontation was about to happen. "Victor, darling, I didn't expect you to arrive so early," Mrs. Martha said, trying to sound affectionate, though the tension behind her words was unmistakable. Victor wasted no time with pleasantries. He walked over to his mother's desk and placed the document Sandra had found on it. "What is this, Mother?" he asked, his voice low and full of emotion. Mrs. Martha looked at the papers, and although she tried to remain composed, Sandra noticed a slight tremor in her hand before she folded her arms across her chest. "Just a few agreements, Victor, things I've been handling to secure our family's future," Mrs. Martha replied with a dismissive tone, but the rigidity in her posture betrayed her true feelings. Victor stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Agreements? Agreements about arranging my marriage to someone I don't love? Agreements that you planned without even consulting me? The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra, watching from the doorway, found it hard to breathe. Mrs. Martha held her son's gaze, but the coldness in her eyes couldn't hide the truth they both knew. Everything I do is for the benefit of this family, Victor, Mrs. Martha finally said, her voice steady but strained. I've made decisions to ensure our future, your future. It's my responsibility to protect you, even when you don't realize it. Victor shook his head, incredulous. Protect me from myself, Mother. I'm an adult. I can make my own decisions, and what you've done is a betrayal. You don't understand me, nor do you understand what I truly want in life. Mrs. Martha slowly rose from her chair, her tall, slender figure casting a long shadow across the room. Her face was a mask of displeasure and wounded pride. And what is it that you want, Victor? To marry a woman who doesn't understand our position and responsibilities? Her, Sandra, you think she can carry the weight of being part of this family? Or are you planning to indulge in the fantasies of youth and destroy everything I've built for you? Sandra felt a lump in her throat as she heard her name spat out from Mrs. Martha's mouth. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't been prepared for the harshness of the contempt in the woman's voice. However, Victor didn't flinch. Mother, this isn't about position or responsibility. This is about love, about respect, about building a life with someone I truly care about and want to share my future with. Sandra is that person, and I won't let you or anyone else decide for me what I should do with my life. Victor's words rang powerfully through the room, and for a moment, Sandra felt a surge of hope. But Mrs. Martha was not one to give in easily. Love, Mrs. Martha repeated with a mixture of disdain and bitterness. Love is fleeting, Victor. Responsibility and duty to our family are forever. You can't build a life on love alone. You need stability, power, and someone who understands that. Victor closed his eyes for a moment, struggling to contain his frustration. Sandra could see the internal battle he was fighting between his respect for his mother and his desire to live his own life. Mother, I respect you, but I can't live by your rules forever. If you can't accept Sandra, then I'll leave. I can't stay here if it means sacrificing my happiness and hers. Sandra's heart raced. Victor was willing to challenge his mother for her, something she had never imagined would happen. But she also knew that this meant a larger confrontation, one that could break Victor's relationship with Mrs. Martha forever. Mrs. Martha observed her son in silence for several long moments before speaking with a voice so cold it made Sandra shiver. If that's your decision, Victor, you must know that you'll be giving up everything this family has provided for you, not just your inheritance, but your status, your respect, everything I've fought to preserve. You'll be a man on your own, and I won't be responsible for the consequences. Her words fell like a heavy burden on Victor's shoulders. Sandra could see his face darken under the weight of the decision he had to make. But Victor remained firm. If that's the price I have to pay for my freedom, then so be it. I'm not willing to live a life that someone else has decided for me, and if that means losing everything I've known, then I'll do it. Sandra felt a mixture of fear and admiration for Victor's determination. She knew this decision would come at a great cost, but she also understood that Victor was ready to give up everything for love and freedom. Mrs. Martha stood still, her cold, calculating eyes assessing her son. Finally, in a voice barely audible but filled with suppressed anger, she said, "Then I wish you luck, Victor, because you'll need it. And when everything falls apart, when you realize what you've lost, don't expect this door to be open to you again." Victor nodded slowly, accepting his mother's words with a combination of sadness and resolve. "I understand, Mother, but I'd rather face those consequences than live a life full of regret." With that, Victor turned and walked out of the room, passing by Sandra without looking at her but gently taking her hand as they left. Sandra felt a whirlwind of emotions as they walked together down the long hallway of the mansion. She knew they had crossed a point of no return, and their lives would never be the same. When they reached the back garden, where the cool night air surrounded them, Victor stopped and looked at Sandra with eyes full of both pain and determination. "I'm so sorry, Sandra. This isn't what I wanted for us, but I can't continue living under my mother's conditions. We'll have to start over, away from here." Sandra nodded, fully understanding what Victor was sacrificing for her, but she also knew that there was no other option if they wanted to be together. "I'm with you, Victor. No matter what happens, we'll face it together," Sandra replied, trying to give him strength even though she too felt uneasy. Victor gave her a faint smile, though the pain of what he had just left behind was still evident in his eyes. "Thank you, Sandra. I don't know what I'd do without you." That night, as the mansion sank into darkness, Victor and Sandra decided to leave Solana and start a new life in the city. They knew the road ahead would be difficult and that they would face many challenges, but they also knew that together, they could overcome any obstacle. With hearts full of hope and anxiety, Sandra and Victor began preparing for their departure, knowing they were leaving behind not just a house, but an entire life. And although the future was uncertain, both knew they were ready to fight for what truly mattered, their love and their freedom. The first rays of dawn began to light up the mansion, which seemed quieter than usual that morning. Sandra and Victor had been up all night, talking about what lay ahead, but the decision had been made: they would leave Solana for good. However, as the first beams of sunlight filtered through the window, they both knew there were still things left to resolve. Victor woke early, feeling the weight of the decision he had made the night before. Leaving his family, his mother, and everything he had known up until that point was not an easy choice. Though he loved Sandra and was ready to sacrifice everything for her, he couldn't help but feel the pain of what he was leaving behind. Sandra, for her part, was also wrestling with inner conflict. While she was sure of her love for Victor and knew that there was no other choice but to leave, she couldn't shake the guilt she felt for being the cause of the rift between Victor and his mother. The previous night had been an emotional whirlwind, and though she knew Victor had made his decision, she couldn't help but wonder if he would regret it in the future. As they prepared to leave, Victor decided that he needed to have one final conversation with his mother. He knew it wouldn't change anything, but he felt he had to try, that he had to at least make her understand why he had made this choice. Sandra supported his decision, though she feared that the conversation might end in even greater pain. Victor found Mrs. Martha in the dining room, sitting alone with a cup of tea in her hand. His mother maintained her calm demeanor, but the tension on her face was clear when she saw her son enter. She showed no emotion, merely observing him with the cold, calculating eyes that Sandra had come to recognize. "Mother, I want to talk to you before I go," Victor said, his voice calm but resolute. Mrs. Martha didn't respond immediately. She took a sip of her tea before placing the cup down and finally looked up at her son. "What is there left to say, Victor?" she replied, her voice sharp as a knife. "You've made your decision, and I don't see what you can say that will change that." Victor stepped closer and sat down across from his mother, looking her straight in the eyes. "Mother, I know you're angry, and I understand that, but I want you to know this wasn't a decision I made lightly. I love Sandra, and I know she's the person I want to spend my life with. I'm not abandoning my family on a whim, I just can't continue to live under the expectations you've imposed on me." Mrs. Martha watched him quietly, and for a moment, Sandra thought she saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. But when she spoke, her voice was still full of bitterness. "Love is an illusion, Victor. You're blinded by a temporary feeling, and you're willing to sacrifice everything this family has built for generations. What will you have left if you follow her? Empty promises and an uncertain future." Victor clenched his fists but remained calm. "What I'll have left, Mother, is the chance to live my life with someone I truly love. I don't want a life filled with power and prestige if it means sacrificing my happiness. And I'm not willing to let my life be controlled by anyone, not even you." Mrs. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain her anger. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less firm. "Victor, you are my son, and I have always wanted the best for you. But if you choose this path, you'll walk it alone. There will be no way back, and when things fall apart, when you realize that love isn't enough to sustain a life, there will be no one here to lift you up." Victor nodded, fully understanding the consequences of his mother's words. "But I would rather live with that uncertainty than follow a path I didn't choose. If it means losing everything I've ever known, so be it. But know that this doesn't change the fact that I will always love you and that you will always be my mother." Victor's words seemed to reach Mrs. Martha. Sandra saw the hardness in her face soften for a brief moment, as if she was considering what her son had said. But that moment quickly passed. Mrs. Martha slowly stood up, as dignified as ever. "I hope one day you will understand what you're giving up, Victor, but I have nothing more to say to you. Do what you think is right." Victor also stood up, knowing there was nothing more he could say to change the situation. He moved closer to his mother in a gesture of farewell, attempting to embrace her, but Mrs. Martha pulled away, avoiding his touch. "Goodbye, Mother," Victor said sadly. "Goodbye, Victor," she replied without looking him in the eye. From then on, Victor and Sandra lived happily together, though many challenges lay ahead. They remained close and supportive of each other, knowing that their bond was strong enough to overcome anything. They often checked in on Mrs. Martha from afar, aware that she remained as controlling and focused on reputation and power as ever.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.